I'm John Batchelor. Larry Kudlow, my colleague and co-host, CNBC, Kudlow Radio on the Weekend. Immigration. In the announcement from Washington this evening of funding for the government through September 15, the caveat was Homeland Security because of the confrontation between the President of the United States' executive order declaring the immigration story in this country broken and members of the Republican Party. What is to be done? Ed Lazear of the Hoover Institution, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, 06 to 09, that's the second Bush administration, is a professor at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's also a Hoover Institution fellow, and writing most recently in the Wall Street Journal opinion page, he proposes three ideas for the Republicans to weigh as they approach immigration reform and respond to the president over these next years, because it'll also be part of the debate in the 2016 election, is my opinion. Ed, a very good evening to you. You have three proposals that are extremely helpful to shape the argument. First, green cards on the basis of occupations and industries. What does that mean? Good evening to you, Ed.
Hi, John. Good to be with you. Well, that's a pretty straightforward approach. It basically says that people are coming into this country now primarily on a family basis, and while there's nothing wrong with family reunification as one of the reasons for bringing people in, it shouldn't trump all other reasons. And in particular, what we need to do is we need to think about the kinds of immigrants who bring the skills into the country that we most need. The question is, how do you decide which ones of those skills are the ones you most need? And there's an easy solution to that, and that is to look at the data. We know that markets respond to pressure, both supply and demand, and when the demand pressure for a particular occupation is high, wages tend to rise. So if we look historically at what has happened over time, we see that occupations, industries like information services, management, pipeline transportation saw rapid wage growth between 2006 and 2014, and that's because those were the ones that had the demand for those skills. So what we should be doing is using the data readily available from the Department of Labor on wage trends in industry and occupations, vacancy rates, unemployment rates. All of that can be used to determine the labor market demand. And if we do that, the big advantage is not only will we get the skills that we need, but it will place the least downward pressure on domestic wages.
Ed, you know, first of all, I like this part very much. A lot of the restrictionists who don't want immigration reform, who basically don't want immigrants, are arguing that more immigration, regardless of whether it's skills-based or family-based, will depress wages. But the evidence doesn't really show that. You cite some studies, some international studies, and actually the CBO study, I think it had a 0.1% increase in unemployment the first year or two, and then the next 10 years, wages went up. In fact, the whole economy went up. In fact, Ed, we need population growth in order to keep the American economy growing.
That's absolutely right, Larry. And you know, I know that you're sympathetic to my argument. You and I seem to generally be on the same page on many issues, and certainly on this one. But I think what people forget when they argue that there are depressing effects on domestic wages is that some effects actually go in the opposite direction. And, you know, economists, I know you went to school in economics and you remember these words, but economists always like to talk about complements and substitutes. Are kinds of workers that you bring in complementary to the kind of labor that we have here, or are they substitutes for the kind of labor? And in large part, the immigrants who are coming in are complements. They help the labor in this country rather than hurting the labor. They make the labor in this country more productive in the same way that bringing capital makes labor more productive. So most of the effects tend to go in that direction. Now, you know, I think, again, as you pointed out at the very beginning of your comment, it's not crazy to say that certain people may be adversely affected, namely the ones who are close substitutes for the immigrants. But the literature shows that even to the extent that those individuals are affected, the effects are very small, and I think the CBO study that you just cited is a case in point.
I just want to emphasize to the audience there are two studies linked on Ed's piece in the Wall Street Journal, one from the Journal of European Economic Association dated 2004, another from the American Economic Review dated 1991, and a third, Institute for the Study of Labor 2014. They're hot links in the Wall Street Journal. Please continue, Larry.
Oh, no, thank you. I just wanted to follow through on another of Ed's points. The expansion of the H1B, Ed, I guess the H1 and H2 in general.
Right.
You know, again, the restrictionists say we don't need this and the jobs are unfilled. Silicon Valley and the Silicon Valley Trade Association wants to double the H1Bs from 65,000 to, I don't know, 130,000 or 150,000. And it's so stupid to have foreign students, you know, graduate from MIT and then send them home. And even Obama's ideas, which I think are extra legal, if you will, he doesn't really let them stay here. He just says you can finish your education. But I never understood that. I mean, we need more engineers, and if we get these smart kids from overseas, why can't they stay here?
You're right, and in fact, there's been a change over time. You know, I teach at Stanford Business School. One of the things that I see is that it used to be the case that the students, the international students who came to Stanford, were just dying to stay in the United States, and now, in part because of pressure to get them out, but also because of demands back home, they are wanting to leave. So people get their degrees here, go back to China, go back to Korea, and can do very well there. So we're giving up very talented people who are stars both when they come from their country and also when they leave our country, and that's talent that we really shouldn't be sacrificing, because again, they are, not only are they valuable to our economy in general, but they tend to be complementary and not substitutes for most of our labor. They help our productivity, they don't hurt it. So those are the kind of people that we want to keep. Your
second proposal, Ed, is to create a new class of visa that has a fee. How would that work, and what would that benefit?
Well, let me just give you the logic first. The idea is this. We know that people who are here as undocumented came into this country for the most part in some illegal fashion. Either they crossed the border illegally or overstayed their visa. So they've broken the law, and we all recognize that breaking the law is not a good thing. The question is, what's the appropriate punishment for people who break the law? And one punishment, of course, is deportation, but that's not the only possible punishment. So what I argue is that we could conceive of dealing with those people, particularly certain ones who have been here for a long time, have kids that have grown up here, and so forth, by essentially fining them. And the way the fine would work is it would simply be a fee on the visa that they are entitled to receive for every year that they remain in the country. So they just get a visa. I call it a Z visa, and with that Z visa they would be entitled to work, but it would cost them something like a few $100s every year to maintain that Z visa, and that would be the fee or the fine that they paid for having entered the country illegally. It's kind of a compromise solution. There's no doubt that it will annoy people on both ends of the spectrum. The people who think these individuals should be given complete amnesty will think it's draconian. The people at the other end will think it's amnesty. But I think it's a reasonable solution. I think it's a sensible solution, and it's one that will get us moving forward, and certainly better than what the president has done.
By the way, it doesn't annoy me. I think it's a good. By the way, Newt Gingrich argued something that was more or less like this in the 2012 Republican debates in the primaries, and I don't think he had a fee. So you've got a fee, but that's probably a small price to pay. I mean, Obama, you know, it's interesting again, besides the extra legal nature of his dictate, which should be legislated, nonetheless, he's only going to let him stay, Ed, for 3 years.
That's right.
And I think that's really a lousy idea. I mean, I think your idea, you're saying as long as they're not criminals, they pay a fee and they can stay. And they can wait for their card, but they can work while they're waiting for their new visa. To me, that's much more sensible. 3 years, I don't know, 3 years doesn't solve anything, if you ask me.
It's an incentive not to come forward, Larry, because you don't know what's going to be at the other side of it. Yes.
Not to come out of out of the dark.
Yes, because if you have a mortgage, 3 years from now could be in jeopardy if there's a new administration.
Right.
That's right, and they certainly can't undertake the kinds of investments and skills and moving on with their lives that you want them to do, and their kids are in jeopardy. So, all of these things I think are not helpful. The president did something that he thought was probably politically wise, and I'm sure believed it was the right thing to do.
And it didn't shut the government down. Ed, let's go to the third recommendation, because this looks to be the most easily enforced because of its nature. Employer-based incentives to deal with the illegal immigration. How does that work in the future?
Well, as we were mentioning earlier, one of the big problems, of course, is that when people come into the country, there are two ways to do it. One is to cross the border illegally, and the other is to come in legally on a visa and then simply overstay it. And the Pew Hispanic Center for one institution tells us that about half of the illegal immigrants who are here today came in through the second channel, namely overstaying their visa. So if you want to get those people, if you want to prevent those people from coming in the future, and if you want to deal with those people right now, there's only one way to do it, and that's to make sure that people who come in illegally in the future cannot work. So the way you do that is you simply say employers, when they hire someone, anyone, have to check the legal status of that individual with the government at the time of hire. If they don't do that, and if the person turns out to be here illegally, then the employer is fined very heavily. But as long as they do it, then the employer is given safe harbor, and that's the easiest way to enforce it. It has two effects. It keeps out the future illegals, and it makes sure that those who are currently here illegally will register and pay the fee for the Z visa and do the appropriate thing. So I think it kills two birds with one stone. I think it's the obvious thing to do. As you and I were discussing earlier, John, I think most people think, Border Patrol is uncontroversial, but the question is how effective will it be, and I think that using incentives is a better way to go.
What role does E-Verify play in this? Because we've had sort of patchy E-Verify systems. Now, that I admit the computer software hookup wasn't all that good, but will that do it?
Well, I think that's the problem. The E-Verify system has not been particularly effective. It's meshed with some other software systems that are in the background that check the status of these individuals. Apparently, there's been relatively easy fraud that's been taking place with those systems, and so we need to beef that up. But I think that would be a much more effective use of government money than trying to build a 15-foot fence or a 50-foot fence all the way across the southern border. That you may want to do that too, but I just don't think that's going to do the job. The higher the fence, the more that are going to simply come in on legal visas and overstay them. So you still need to get to the employer channel. If you don't get there, you're not going to keep people out.
One detail, Ed, just at the close here, and we have about 30 seconds. Your first recommendation about market-based or industry-based visas or immigration, that resembles Canada's and Germany's. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is some similarity. Canada and Germany, both, and Switzerland as well, they all use a point system where they allocate slots on the basis of skills. The one problem that you always have is when the government is using points or using simulated prices, it tends to get political, and I wouldn't argue that this doesn't suffer from the same problem, but that's why I wanted to anchor it in terms of the data, actually make it rely on hard facts, Department of Labor data, and let's focus on that rather than who one party wants to have in versus another party.
Edward Lazear is a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for the second Bush administration, professor at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, a Hoover Institution fellow. Larry Kudlow, CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend. I'm John Batchelor.